But what I'm wanting to do in these few minutes of my talk tonight is talk a little bit, first of all, about the film, but also situate this film in the context of this wonderful conference that we've had the first day of. And I'm aware that the audience is partly composed of those of you who've been talking all of today and some broader members of the public audience. So I think, like the art exhibition curated by Niloufar Farouk in Pakistan, No Honour in Killing, which we saw images from and discussed last night, this film exemplifies the enormous power of creative arts in various media to touch diverse audiences and to unsettle preconceived meanings and values about such heinous acts. There is much I could say about the cinematic qualities of this film. Its unobtrusive observational style, the way that it focuses on the main characters in the two cases of the death of Nesreen and the ongoing horrific flight by Savin, the way that it doggedly pursues the truth in these cases through the veils of denials, cover-ups and egregious accounts of why women should be murdered. I found the scenes with Nesreen's children especially harrowing, in witnessing how they've been enjoined to deny their love for their dead mother. But then we witnessed her daughter's surreptitious smile as she confessed that she dreamed of her hugs and kisses, and her palpable delight in receiving the iconic present of blue jeans, a diminutive version of her mother's bloodied death shroud. The tenacity and the courage of the activists and journalists pursuing these stories and pursuing justice for such women in the face of threats of violence and even death themselves is consummately captured. Runak Farouj, Khaltoum, Gona, Lawan, Hamen. But I suppose what I find exceptional about the film is the way in which it captures this and the kind of relational field of their interactions with the main characters in these cases. And I think the sense of kind of earnestness and indeed the sort of intrepid courage that they evince is nicely balanced by intimate and humorous family scenes. I especially love that one between Runak and her husband in the kitchen, and then in the living room, an educated, urban, liberally minded husband and wife debating the ideals of gender equality and Zoroastrianism. And I also love the scenes with the older activist, Runak Rao, and her decision after a long, loving marriage with her husband, the judge, not to live under the hands of any man. I also thought the soundtrack by Wendy Blackstone was evocative and really beautifully pitched. And indeed, the only false note I found in this film was the framing by the CNN presenter, which rather coarsely, I think, portrays the problem with a typically neo-imperial gaze on this part of the world from the lens of America. But in my short reflections with you tonight, I wanted to distill some of the themes from this film that resonate with what Carolyn Strange and the organisers of this superb conference are trying to do. As I see it, they are not just trying to interrogate this very problematic phrase, honour killing, by putting scare quotes around the words, but surely by suggesting that to use the title of Niloufar's presentation, there is no honour in killing, or in the words of the present Kurdistan government campaign, dishonour killing. And I think they're trying to dislodge the way in which that anodyne phrase is rigidly attached in much popular culture emanating from the West and beyond with the other. Others defined by their location in the place of the Middle East, their Islamic faith, their archaic or tribal character, or their unsettling presence as resistant diasporic people, sleeping cells in the heart of a metropolitan modernity. I suggest that there are important continuities between the link chain of the armour of associations apropos this form of gender violence with otherness, other places, other times, other faiths. And in contrast, we've heard much during the course of today about the diversity and the complexity of forms of honour killing or cognate acts in different times and different places. We started with passages from Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, quoted to us by Andrew Lee, our local MP for Fraser, which forcefully reminded us of the history of honour killings in Western genealogies dating back to classical Greece and Rome. We heard a keynote consummately comparing aristocratic duels in Europe and honour killings in Europe's contemporary diaspora of migrants from the Middle East and North Africa. We listened to the intimate relation between women's chastity and the power of the father in ancient Rome in ways which blurred the boundaries of intimate personal and political acts. We heard about the way in which honour was implicated in rivalrous challenges between white colonial settler men in Australia, but not even imagined in the frontier violence perpetrated against Indigenous people, which was rather seen as enacting the laws of nature, thus dehumanising Aboriginal men and women. We were told about the profound problems in distinguishing honour killing in the UK from other forms of domestic violence, and the risks that by unduly segregating the first, discriminatory stigmatisations were perpetuated on the basis of race, culture or religion, the Africans, the Muslims, etc. We also heard about how far the practices of those defending honour killings on the basis of faith differ profoundly from the acts so enjoined in the sacred texts of both Christianity and Islam, differences between Old and New Testaments, etc., etc. But we also found out about how men could be victims of honour killings according to customary law among Bugis Makassar in Indonesia, and how if couples eloped and families thus lost their city or dignity, imams were rather engaged in attempts at reconciliation and making peace. And we discussed the problematic character of the imam's house of a place of women's refuge. We also heard about how women, homosexual men and travestis, transgendered people in South America, have all been humiliated, tortured and abused in the name of an authoritarian, martial, hegemonic masculinity, and how broader collective political violence can be simultaneously gender violence. My apologies, but other urgencies prevented me from hearing the trio of papers this afternoon, and I apologise for that, but I gather these traversed equally compelling examples in Italy, Turkey and Kurdistan, the very place in which the film we've just watched is situated. Most of these acts involve the murder of women, more rarely men, and especially homosexual men or transgendered persons, because their sexual or reproductive practices breach cultural norms which are strenuously and avowedly masculinist. They typically articulate the borders of women's bodies with the borders of a collectivity, such that women's sexual chastity, their fidelity, and their dedicated mothering are associated with the honour and indeed the purity of a family, a clan, a caste, a religion, a nation. So women who have sex before or outside marriage, women who have failed to be good mothers, and women or girls who've been brutally raped, even gang raped, are liable to be murdered. Gender double standards, not just about sexuality, but about parenting, are of course commonplace across time, place and culture. Male promiscuity, polygamy, and absent fathering are often seen to be rather the characteristic of the man through. I'm using here a phrase from P&G's Talk Pigeon, but we heard a similar articulation of this idea of a real man in what we've presently seen. And indeed, these very qualities may be seen to enhance the honour of a family, a clan, etc. But I think, as we observed during our very vigorous discussions today, it's important to acknowledge both male victims and female perpetrators in such practices. And I think this film very graphically demonstrates the importance of female perpetrators. And this is why in the work that I've presently been doing, I prefer the generic concept of gender violence for all such acts. So in recent research, and especially in the process of completing a book about engendering violence in PNG, I've been inspired by some recent magisterial work by the legal anthropologist Sally Engel-Mary from New York University. And if you just bear with me, I'm just going to quote a couple of passages. She defines violence, gender violence, as violence whose meaning depends on the gendered identities of the parties. It is an interpretation of violence through gender. And so this admits the space, we're talking primarily about women, but this also admits the space of male victims, and also, I think, admits the possibility of gender violence between same-sex couples, etc. I quote again, "Gender violence is not a new problem. It takes place in virtually all societies around the world, but only in the last 30 years has it become visible as a social issue." And finally, understanding gender violence requires looking both at the intimate details of family life and at geopolitical considerations of power and warfare. In order to understand gender violence, it is necessary to understand the world. As we know, gender violence in places like Australia, the United States and Europe is commonplace. It tends to be concentrated in homes and is called by that other anodyne phrase, and here I owe a debt to Jocelyn Scutt, domestic violence. I agree with her that renaming this as criminal assault in the home is probably a good legal and political move. But how we see the violent abuse of wives and their murder, usually by husbands, is typically within the lens of a marriage or a cohabiting relation which is not only idealised as entailing the mutual consent of the parties, both parties, even their enduring mutual love, but as allegedly, and I would want to say allegedly, disembodied from the broader kinship collectivities of families, clans and communities. This kind of gender violence does not therefore get marked as cultural, and I think this is a big problem in our use of the culture concept. And in fact, Sally Engel-Mary and others have been writing beautifully, I think, about how it's important not to accept this definition of culture as something rarefied, something homogenous, something uncontested, something unchanging, which I think is often we give up when we say the articulators of these patriarchal traditions are spokespeople for culture. I think equally the women who are the activists challenging this are spokespeople for their cultures. So although I think that there are important differences between the way in which gender violence implicates persons and collectivities in forms where more relational forms of personhood prevail and those where more individuated models of person and of gendered agency exist, I think that in unduly stressing the differences to the exclusion of similarities risks denying our shared humanity and indeed our historical connections. Different models of marriage and the relations between sexual couples and collectivities, I think, are in profound contemporary contest. And in profound contemporary contest in a way which is geopolitically configured. So the gender violence of others, their practices, are seen as tribal, archaic, backward, not yet modern. And we heard a lot of this kind of language of stages and tribalism and so forth in the very film we've seen. But they can also be seen as contesting and resistant forms of patriarchal justice, which are challenging modernity, and especially a modernity unduly defined by reified images of the West or America. So I remain haunted by that image of Nesrin's blue jeans, bloodied and peeled back.